Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Alex, and today we're going to talk about mapping API errors in Spring WebFlux. So this took me quite a while to figure out, because usually if we are using an API that is serving JSON over HTTP, everything can be perfectly fine most of the time, but of course there can be errors, like using an invalid authorization, then the API will respond with an error. And this is really a cross-cutting concern. So whenever we have to deal with these errors, they can happen on all of the endpoints usually. So we don't want to handle them on a per endpoint basis, but on a centralized place. And this is what we're going to use the exchange filter function for. The approach that I'm sharing is probably not the only one that you can use, but it's one that gets the job done. And the API that we're going to use for this example is the GitHub API, because it has some public endpoints that we can easily use. It has also some error messages that we can easily map. So let's take a look at what we're going to build. So as you can see here, there is one call that provides us a repository. And all that we need is the owner and the repository. And we are encouraged to provide a header. So we're specifying the API version that we're going to use. And this is this one. So we're using the version 3 of the GitHub API. So with that said, let's code. So we are in the IDE now. So I've created a simple Spring Boot project, and let's start with looking at the build file. So as you can see, I have the basic Spring Boot starter dependencies for WebFlux, because this is what we're going to use. And the only additional dependency that I'm going to use is Jackson module Kotlin. And this is because we are dealing with JSON from the GitHub API, and I want an easy way of map it to our Kotlin classes. So let's take a look at what the API actually provides us for any given repository. Let me open the terminal, that makes it easier. So I'm doing a GET request to the API, and I'm fetching the Spring Boot project. So let's see what the API returns for that. That's a lot of data. I hope you can see it. There are many details, but we are only, of course, interested in a subset. So this is the first thing that we're going to do. We build a class that is mapping a repository, and we take it from there. So let's start with a simple data class for the repository. Called repository, apparently. So the things that we're interested in is the description. That's a string. And let's also pick the number of forks. That's an int, and the stars. Yeah, that should also be in there. It's called differently on the API, so we have to provide an alias because that's kind of clunky, and it's called stargazers count. That looks about right. Good. Next thing that we're going to need is our web client. So let's use the application class and provide our own bean for that. The good thing is that Spring can provide us a builder already. So we can go web client builder. That should work. Let's see what's missing. And we return the web client once we're done. So this is a good place to configure the bean, the actual web client. And we're going to use that because, as we have seen, we have to provide that header to make GitHub happy. It's not strictly required, but it's just a good approach of doing it. So we're going to do builder, build, that's for today, header. So we're providing the accept header. Let me just copy that if it's still here. So this is the one. Okay, let's chuck it in there, and then let's build. So this provides the web client that we're going to use to make the API requests, and that's pretty much it. So let's go to the test and test this code. There we are. So we need the web client in our tests, and the easiest way to do this is to just inject it. Web client, so that's the web client. That's the one that we just configured, and something's not quite right. Yeah, so I'm gonna do this. It's too late in it. Just make sure it's there. So, and then we use client get. Now for the URI component, we provide the scheme, which is HTTPS. Then we have the host. That's API GitHub.com. And then there's the path segments, providing a couple. So that was repos, that was Spring project, I think, and Spring Boot build. Can format this a bit nicer later on. So this is the URI already. What we need now is called retrieve. And I usually like to do await body. And we want to put this into a repository. Yeah, so in order for me to use await, I have to be in a coroutine scope actually. And I'm going to do this because I find it much easier to deal with coroutines than with the more functional approach. So let me put this here on repository equals. Let's just print it. Can also have a logger if we need, but let's just print this here just to make sure that works. That's about it. So that should already work. So if we run this test now, let's see what's happening. All right, so let's see what has happened. There are a couple of issues that I have, but that's platform specific because I'm using the new M1 chips from Apple, and there are apparently some errors, but this shouldn't concern us too much. The only thing that's really interesting is this one. So we can see that we got the repository. We can see it's a Spring Boot repository. That's good. You can see the number of forks and the stars, so that works. So that was the straightforward case that I wanted to show, and that's how most of the API interactions actually work. But now the interesting thing is, of course, what happens if it doesn't work? So what we can do here is, I've been using Spring Boot, but let's make Spring Boss. Like looking for something that probably doesn't exist, unless it does. So we can see that we get a probably HTTP 404. It was not found, and the documentation URL where we can see how to make a call to get a repository. That's actually the page that we've been on before. So this is actually good because this is what we're gonna test now. So first of all, what we're gonna do is we provide a data class that's mapping that kind of error. So a message and documentation URL. So let's get back to our application, and then we provide a new data class. So over here, let's say API error response. Two things. So there was the message, which is a string. Oh, come on. And the other one is, let's call it docs. I'm providing a JSON alias here again, because why not? And the alias was documentation URL. All right, so this provides us a neat way to actually map the error we've just seen. And now comes the interesting part, because this is now where we want to handle the error directly. And this is where we use the exchange filter. So let's go and create that here as well. It must be a component, so Spring can pick it up during the component scanning class. We call it error filter. And that's an exchange filter function. And there's just one method that we're going to implement, which is filter. So the way this works is you can have multiple filters, and what we can see is that we are provided with a request and a reference to the next exchange function. So the idea is that you have you have a chain of filters that each request needs to travel until it eventually is sent out. And then when the request comes back, that's the response, it also has to travel through a certain chain, and then you can manipulate it as you like. So what we're going to do is now we directly forward the current request. So this is what we're going to do, because we're not interested in a request, but in a response. So, and this is what we get, right? We pass on the request and we get a response, and now we can play around with the response. So, and this is the actual code. This is the only interesting bit for this tutorial. What we're going to do is we get the response, we make a flat map, and then use the response. And now we can check if there's an error by checking the status code. So we say is error, only then we want to do something with the response. If it's an error, we do body to mono, and passing in our API error response, class reference. So this is where we actually map the JSON that we got from the GitHub API to the object, which is the API error response. And once we have that, we have to further work with that because we cannot just return the API error response, but what we need to return is an error, or more specifically, we have to signal an error to the mono. So what we're going to do here is flat map, being more explicit with the names. Now we have the error, and we can say mono error. I'll get to that in a second. So else, just doing this, if the response is not an error, we still have to pass on the response to the application, and we just say mono just response. So that will just pass it on. So now in order for us to signal an error, we need an instance of throwable, because we cannot just pass on the naked API error response. So what we now need is an actual instance of throwable that we can pass on the API error response. So it's kind of a wrapper that we can use as a signal here. So API error, and just pass on the actual error that we got, API error response, and that should be, you can directly make it a throwable, so that should work. So this is the API error that we can pass to the mono, and it will just wrap our API error response. So we should not need this, but API error response, and I'm messing things up here. So if everything goes well, this should now work, but it doesn't. So let's see where we went off. Oh yeah, API error, that's the exception, and it has the response. So that should work. And this is the only relevant bit. This is where we filter the response, and if the response has an error, we map it to our own object and return that as part of the exception, or we just forward the response by doing this. So and everything goes well. So the final bit that we need to do now is to test this over and over in our test. So here we go again. Let's first make sure the test still prints what we would expect here. It's not a good way of testing by printing, but it works for this case. So we can still see the repository is there. So that still works. So now let's just change something and see if we run into an error. And since we are doing this, let's just wrap things over here. Let's do this and directly catch our error, API error. If we have it, let's print cause error. So let's double check this. So what we're going to do is, again, we're using the web client that we have configured already. We now provide a repository that does not exist, so that should raise the error message or the API error response. We map this now to our own API error and then just print it. That's the easy case. So let's see if that works as expected. So a test has failed. That's not too bad. Okay, let's see. And oh yeah, so nothing has happened actually. So we can see that there was an exception, but this was a generic one, web client response exception, but it's not the one that we would expect. So because this is something that we have missed, we created this error filter, but it's not yet announced to the web client. So we have to configure our web client over here. So what we're going to do is use the error filter, get it injected here, and we'll just say filter, and now that should work. So let's go back to the test, and let's just run that again, and then see if it works now. Yeah, so we can see already over here it says API error response. So this is the object or the class that we have now mapped to JSON response. We can now access the message and the docs if we want. And that's pretty much it. I hope this was useful. If you want to see more of that content, please consider subscribing. And if you want to see other topics covered, just let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.